Hey guys, tonight we will embark on a journey to uncover never-before-told secrets about 6 women who were both shaped and shattered by the Tudor dynasty. These are not glittering fairy tales, but a tragic epic of power, love, and betrayal with 101 facts compiled from countless historical sources and legends, ensuring no misattribution or exaggeration of these figures. I promise you, when we reach fact 45, you will be truly stunned beyond belief. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And don't forget to share which facts you believe to be true and which ones still seem doubtful. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. And most importantly, if any fact here makes you nod in agreement, please comment its number and title. And if any fact raises your eyebrow in doubt, don't hesitate to share, so we can discuss together. This is a space for history lovers. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And I can't wait to dive into the conversation with you. First fascinating fact, Catherine of Aragon was already a widow of Prince Arthur before becoming Henry VIII's wife, Catherine of Aragon, whose full name was Catalina de Aragon, was born in 1485 as the eldest daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. From childhood, she carried the immense mission of uniting 2 great kingdoms, Spain and England. In February of 1501, the 16-year-old maiden left the Alhambra Palace at dawn and boarded a wooden ship bound for England, where cold winds and turbulent seas awaited her. By November of that same year, at the storied St. Paul's Cathedral in London, Catherine and Arthur, Prince of Wales, were wed in one of Europe's most lavish royal ceremonies, symbolizing the historic alliance between their 2 crowns. Only 5 months later, at the end of March in 1502, Arthur fell gravely ill and died, a loss historians attribute to tuberculosis or meningococcal disease. The young girl, barely 17, found herself a widow, still wearing her wedding gown, scented faintly with fresh flowers, stepping out of Ludlow Castle in inconsolable grief. Arthur's death was not only a personal tragedy for Catherine, but also shattered the crucial diplomatic pact between England and Spain. Instead of allowing her to return home to Castile to remarry according to Spanish custom, Henry VII chose to keep Catherine in England as a bargaining chip. For 7 long years, she lived within the confines of the royal court in a state of ambiguity, neither crowned queen nor free to decide her own destiny. In silence and solitude, Catherine bore the weight of diplomatic expectations and profound loss. When Henry VIII finally ascended the throne, she was remarried, but no longer as the hopeful 16-year-old bride, but as a living testament to the ruthless realities of royal politics. And just as Catherine's story tested her endurance, we now turn to the second fascinating fact. Second fascinating fact, Catherine was only 16 when she first set foot in England. The journey from the Alhambra to Plymouth spanned thousands of miles, but for Catherine it seemed 100 times longer due to her unfamiliarity and loneliness. On the rocking deck of the wooden ship, she battled homesickness and seasickness. When she finally arrived at the misty, stone-walled courts of Plymouth, she was ushered straight into an austere royal household, its corridors draped in shadowy tapestries. The 16-year-old princess spoke not a word of English. Every request from May, "I have a cup of water to, where is the great hall," had to be relayed through an interpreter. Her slender frame trembled in the chill, prompting the English ladies in waiting to shake their heads and complain. The princess is hard to please. The damp, biting cold of England stood in stark contrast to the golden sun and dry breezes of Granada, forcing her to don heavy layers of clothing while English courtiers merely wore fur caps. Under dim candlelight, the royal ceremonies dragged on for hours. and Catherine bowed her head as instructed. Every gesture, every sound felt alien. She managed a tentative smile, but her eyes betrayed fear as she saw rows of empty chairs awaiting her curtsy. On her first night in the palace, Catherine tossed in fitful sleep, dreaming of her parents and horses running southward, only to awaken to silent darkness and the keen edge of isolation. Haunted by homesickness and the bewildering new culture, Catherine spent those opening days as though on an exhausting odyssey, and 5 months after arriving in England, an even greater tragedy awaited her. Third fascinating fact: Prince Arthur died after only 5 months of marriage, leaving Catherine a 17-year-old widow. Following their grand wedding on the 14th of November in 1501, Catherine and Arthur took up residence at Ludlow Castle, hopeful for a happy future. Yet Arthur's fragile health and recurring fevers would change everything. At the end of March, in 1502, the prince succumbed to a swift and fatal illness. Catherine, just 17, had barely begun to learn the duties of a queen when she was thrust into grief. The image of Catherine kneeling by Arthur's bedside as he slipped away remains one of the most poignant moments in royal history. She wept uncontrollably, clutching his sleeve, only to find herself a young widow, bearing the burden of an entire realm. In fewer than 6 months of marriage, she carried the weight of a kingdom's hopes and its devastation. Arthur's death not only ended a political marriage, but also trapped Catherine in a cruel stalemate. Henry VII could not send her back to Spain without jeopardizing the alliance, nor fully embrace her as queen with Arthur gone. Thus, she awaited her fate for 7 years, longing for Henry VIII's succession to deliver her from uncertainty. Each night's dream brought the ache of loss, painting a stark portrait of a medieval royal woman's precarious life. And so the first 3 fascinating facts have revealed the painful beginnings. In the next section, we will uncover more truths that will keep you turning pages in the night. Fact 4: Catherine endured 7 years of poverty after Arthur's death. Rather than being sent home to Spain to reclaim her dowry or remarry under Castilian custom, Catherine of Aragon was held by Henry VII as a diplomatic guarantee. For 7 long years, she lived within the royal precincts on a drastically reduced allowance, unable to negotiate or assert any personal claim. At first, Catherine maintained a sizable retinue of attendants, but gradually the Tudor court shaved her budget down until only a handful of loyal servants remained by her side. The life of a Spanish princess in that era was supposed to be one of opulence and deference, but Catherine's reality was the exact opposite. Her meals were meagre. She often complained of stale bread for dinner in letters to her father, King Ferdinand. Her gowns, once regal and flowing, were patched and repatched until they hung in uneven tatters. Firewood was so scarce that cold nights in her chambers became a daily battle against frost. By necessity, Catherine learned to mend her own dresses, wash her undergarments by hand, and patch together tiny scraps of fabric into serviceable clothing. This meanness was not mere thriftiness. It was a calculated display of power. Catherine had been too important to send away, yet too expensive to support fully. She was, in the eyes of the court, a bargaining chip, neither queen nor commoner, simply the Spanish widow, who must be kept alive but silenced. The result was profound humiliation. Once the daughter of 2 of Europe's most powerful monarchs, she was reduced to a princess of no value, treasured only for her political worth, and despised for her upkeep. Her 7-year exile from public favour left emotional scars as deep as her material deprivations. Fact 5: She was forced to sell her royal jewels to feed herself and her small household. As her meagre allowance dwindled to nothing, Catherine resorted to pawning and selling her dowry jewels bit by bit. Each piece she gave up carried the weight of family memory: the ruby necklace gifted by her mother, the pearl earrings from her grandfather, the golden cross from her grandmother. To the Tudor merchants of London, these were precious commodities to be exchanged for bread, cheese, and coal. But for Catherine, Every transaction was a painful trade of heritage for mere survival. Imagine Catherine, seated by the dim candlelight of her private chamber, arranging parchment deeds of sale next to the jeweled artifacts she once wore with pride. She meticulously signed documents transferring ownership, knowing that each line of ink sealed the loss of a memory, a token of her royal lineage. Meanwhile, her few remaining attendants, haggard and underpaid, waited anxiously for their wages, clutching their meagre earnings in trembling hands. The princess, who had once walked in halls resplendent with sunlight and silk, now found herself haunted by the clink of coin and the echo of her own despair. This act of bartering away her own past is one of the starkest reminders that high birth offered no immunity from ruin under Tudor policy. Women of royal blood could find themselves penniless and powerless, their identity reduced to collateral in negotiations they never chose. For Catherine of Aragon, selling her jewels was the clearest symbol of her fall from grace, the transformation from princess of promise into widow without a throne. Fact 6. She was kept as a political prisoner, forbidden to remarry or return home following Arthur's untimely death. Catherine entered a state no one could have foreseen. She became a political prisoner in all but name. Henry VII barred her from returning to Spain to reclaim her dowry. Yet he also forbade any other marriage, effectively freezing her life in a limbo of court intrigue. For 7 years, Catherine existed in a peculiar in-between, too valuable to send back, too burdensome to treat with full royal honour. Court records show that her spending was strictly controlled and her household carefully monitored. Any letter she attempted to send to her father, Ferdinand II, might lie unopened for months until officials permitted its delivery. Meanwhile, Henry VIII, her future husband, used Catherine as a diplomatic pawn, promising her hand when it served his purposes, then withholding it when alliances shifted. This political hostage status took a heavy toll on Catherine's spirit. Contemporary notes describe nights of fitful sleep, weight loss, and the musty confines of her aging apartments at Greenwich. Formerly a princess with clear lineage and purpose, she became a shadow wandering the corridors of St. James's Palace. Young yet prematurely aged by stress and uncertainty, her enforced stillness set the stage for the next chapter in her life, one that would finally allow her to wed Henry VIII, but also demand the ultimate endurance of her will and dignity. Fact 7. Henry VIII married Catherine in 1509 for political gain, not love on. The 21st of April in 1509, the 18-year-old Henry VIII succeeded his father as king. Almost immediately after his coronation, he moved to wed Catherine of Aragon, the same princess who had spent 7 years as a widow in his father's court. Their marriage was arranged in secrecy and haste, solemnized on the 11th of June 1509 before a handful of trusted courtiers. There were no lavish declarations of affection or poetic serenades. The ceremony marked a strategic alliance with Spain above all else. At 23, Catherine was proclaimed Queen of England with barely a moment to reflect on the personal implications. Speeches that heralded her as Henry's new bride focused exclusively on diplomatic advantage, a sure reinforcement of England's standing among Europe's great powers. In his letters to King Ferdinand II of Aragon, Henry VIII spoke not of his heart's stirrings but of enhancing England's prominence abroad. As historian Alison Weir observed, this was a marriage of 2 dynasties, not of 2 souls. Catherine understood her role from the outset. She was no romantic partner but a strategic asset in the king's continental ambitions. Fact 8. Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times during her reign, almost immediately after the wedding. Catherine faced her paramount duty as queen to produce a male heir. Between 1511 and 1525, she conceived on no fewer than 6 occasions. Each pregnancy was fraught with mortal danger. For Tudor-era medicine relied on bloodletting, dubious herbal treatments, and theories of balancing the 4 humours. Physicians bled her and administered potions without understanding of infection or anatomy, convinced that such measures would safeguard the unborn child. Her first 3 pregnancies ended in miscarriage. each loss a private terror and a public spectacle. By the fourth, court observers noted Catherine well into her second trimester, that hopeful that she carried a healthy child only for the fetus to perish before birth. In her fifth pregnancy, she bore a royal son who lived for a mere 52 days before succumbing to infant mortality. The Tudor machine brooked no weakness. Each reproductive failure threatened not only Catherine's emotional well-being, but also the stability of Henry's reign. She endured relentless pressure from the court, painstaking labour, and whispered warnings that if she cannot produce a son, solutions must be found. Through 6 arduous pregnancies, Catherine teetered between hope and despair, a tragic emblem of royal women forced to bear the entire weight of dynastic expectation. Fact 9. Only once did Catherine give birth to a surviving child. Princess Mary. Of all her 6 pregnancies, Catherine achieved just one enduring success, the birth of Mary Tudor. Later, Queen Mary I. On the 18th of February in 1516, the court erupted in cautious celebration, though many eyes remained fixed on the absence of a prince. Henry VIII lauded the baby girl as a royal princess and organised elaborate festivities, yet his heart remained set on a male heir. Catherine's relief at Mary's survival was tempered by the knowledge that only a son could secure the Tudor line. The early years of Mary's life were marked by a mix of affection and disappointment. Catherine rejoiced to cradle her daughter, yet the court's tone cooled as Mary grew into childhood. Henry's own words cut sharply: "She is not the son I require." In time, Mary was declared illegitimate during the annulment crisis, straining her relationship with both father and mother. Mary later reflected on her mother's sorrow, recalling Catherine's quiet tears in the dimly lit nursery as she prayed over Mary's cradle. This solitary triumph, bearing a living child, stood in stark contrast to 6 prior losses and underlined the unrelenting political calculus that defined Catherine's life as queen and mother. Fact 10. A nearly full term. Male fetus was born stillborn, horrifying the court. During Catherine's 4th pregnancy, around March of 1514, she progressed well into her 3rd trimester, convincing everyone that a prince would finally emerge. Labour began after days of excruciating contractions, a situation likely exacerbated by malposition or a placental complication unknown to Tudor physicians. The court prepared for a royal birth with trumpets, prayers, and the promise of a new king. Yet when the baby emerged fully formed but not breathing, the celebration turned to shock. In the hushed chaos that followed, ladies in waiting wept openly, clergy chanted desperate prayers, and Catherine collapsed by the birthing bed, clutching the lifeless infant. Henry VIII, once brimming with anticipation, recoiled in pale horror, reportedly muttering, "This is a grim portent from on high." Word spread swiftly that the marriage itself had incurred divine disfavour. This stillborn boy's death became the cruel pivot for Henry's later annulment efforts, highlighting his conviction that the union was flawed even before the Act of Supremacy or the break with Rome. The loss of this nearly full-term prince, so widely anticipated, remains one of Tudor history's most savage turning points, ushering in legal battles, schismatic church politics, and forging the path to the Reformation in England. These 4 facts chart Catherine's journey through forced allegiance, repeated heartbreak, and a single fleeting victory. In the next segment, we will continue to unravel the complexities of her life under the Tudor crown. Fact 11. Tudor physicians blamed Catherine's miscarriages on her melancholic disposition. In Tudor medicine, the humoral theory ruled every diagnosis and cure. Illness was thought to arise from an imbalance of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. After multiple miscarriages, Catherine of Aragon was diagnosed by St. Thomas's hospital doctors as excessively melancholic, meaning her sadness had poisoned her womb with toxic vapours. Rather than investigate real medical causes, placental complications, infection, or fetal abnormalities. Court physicians insisted her own melancholy was to blame. Both the royal court and Catherine's own family came to believe she was weeping her unborn children to death. To prevent further loss, she was strictly forbidden from showing emotion, no tears, nor lamentations, not even mentioning past miscarriages to her daughter. Mary, during each labour, a royal doctor stood, watch not with kindness, but with threats that one tear shed will snuff out the baby within. Examinations turned cruelly clinical before treatment. She was ordered to smile and appear cheerful, as though forced gaiety could restore her humoral balance. Her treatments included repeated bloodletting and herbal potions meant to soothe her spirits, along with advice to attend court entertainments, juggler shows or jesters' performances to lift her mood. No one considered her nutritional needs, rest requirements, or the genuine stress she endured. Into their eyes, her natural sorrow became the enemy, obscuring any chance at proper medical care. Thus, Catherine lived in fear that every tear might doom another child, trapping her in a spiral of anxiety that only deepened her melancholia. Fact 12. Henry's sympathy turned to cruelty as Catherine's pregnancies failed. At first, Henry VIII approached Catherine's miscarriages with genuine concern, frequently visiting her bedside and expressing worry for her health. But after 3 losses in quick succession, his attitude shifted from empathy to suspicion and, eventually, harshness. He began to see each failed pregnancy as a bad omen proof. He believed that Catherine was unfit to bear the realm's future king. Henry openly debated the legality of his marriage with religious scholars and lawyers, questioning its validity on grounds that his brother's widow could not lawfully serve as queen. He accused Catherine of unworthiness, mocking her as too contemplative to be a mother. At a Privy Council meeting, he ordered advisers to consider stripping her of the title of queen to preserve the crown. A letter he sent to the Spanish court in 1523 bluntly stated, "I cannot wait any longer without a male heir." In private, Henry grew distant. He halted all intimate gestures, confined his conversations to formal court matters, and ceased any mention of familial warmth. Foreign ambassadors noted the royal bedchamber had grown cold and unwelcoming. Its door seldom opened to Catherine. This growing cruelty deepened her despair. Not only had she lost child after child, but she also felt the final warmth of her husband's compassion vanish, leaving her alone in the political machinery she once served. Fact 13. By 1525, Catherine's 40th year, Henry had lost all patience. In 1525, Catherine reached the age of 40, considered advanced for childbearing in the 16th century. Since Mary's birth in 1516, she had not borne another child. Henry, now in his mid-30s and still vigorous, concluded Catherine's reproductive value was spent. He began to view her not with pity but with contempt, viewing her as defective and ready to be replaced. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, urged him toward a younger bride to renew England's dynastic hopes. Cromwell ceded doubts about the marriage's legality, citing Catherine's previous union with Arthur, Henry's brother. Henry accepted these arguments, quietly sidelining Catherine from political affairs. She was banned from court councils, her access to the king curtailed, and exiled in spirit, if not in body, to Greenwich. Once his companion, Catherine was now deemed a political liability. All official references to her shifted from queen to princess dowager, a title draped in humiliation. She was publicly blamed for the failure to produce a son, her personal worth recast as a measure of dynastic success. In letters to the Pope, Henry spoke of her as a threat to the Tudor succession, laying the groundwork for the annulment that would banish her from the realm of power entirely. Fact 14. As Henry pursued Anne Boleyn, Catherine was barred from his private chambers. After more than 15 years of marriage, Catherine found herself increasingly shunned. In 1526, Henry became enamoured with Anne Boleyn. are vivacious young noblewomen. To conceal their affair, Henry ordered Catherine to remain strictly separated from him. She was forbidden entry to his private apartments, and every letter she sent had to be screened and delivered by royal guards. Even private banquets at Hampton Court excluded her presence. Catherine wandered the palace gardens at Hampton in lonely routine, hearing Henry's footsteps echo toward Anne's quarters. Court records depict her sitting outside closed doors, straining to catch any sound of her husband's voice before retreating to an empty chamber. Her requests for a consoling word or a reassuring embrace went unanswered. Replies came only in curt, formal missives. This prohibition on private audiences marked Catherine's final descent from centre stage to court exile. Stripped of even minimal influence, she lived as a sidelined relic of Henry's past ambitions. The abrupt reversal of her fortunes left her desolate, deprived not only of status and hope for an heir, but of the basic human connection she had once known. In that cold isolation, Catherine of Aragon faced the deepest betrayal of her life, the loss of the companionship she had served and cherished for so many years. Fact 15. The annulment was a public spectacle, a humiliating show trial of Catherine. Rather than quietly seek a separation, Henry VIII chose to stage an outright legal spectacle before the world. When the Pope's court in Rome would not grant his annulment, Henry broke with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. From 1529 onward, the effort to annul his marriage to Catherine became a matter of state at Westminster Hall. The proceedings stretched across 4 years, encompassing hundreds of sessions, handbills distributed in the streets, and testimony from every corner of the realm. Catherine was summoned to defend herself against Henry's team of lawyers. Forced to stand upon the same dais as her accusers, she faced invasive questioning about her marriage to Arthur. Did she consummate the union? How often? In what circumstances? These inquiries, once the most private of matters, were dissected in public before nobles, diplomats, and commoners alike. Henry cast Catherine as a deceiver of the crown and an obstacle to the nation. His accusations printed on legal documents for every English subject to read. When the verdict finally permitted Henry to claim one lawful wife only, Catherine of Aragon, Queen for 24 years, lost everything in an instant: her title, her dignity, and her daughter Mary's legitimacy, declared null and void. The annulment proceedings became the most savage political theatre England had ever seen, stripping Catherine of her honour and paving the way for the English Reformation under Henry's own spiritual leadership. Fact 16. Catherine was forced to detail her intimate life with Arthur before an audience. Between 1529 and 1533, Catherine was called before the Legatine Court at Westminster Hall, overseen by Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Here, she endured the most invasive interrogation any royal wife had ever faced. Did you lie with Arthur? How many times, in what positions, on which nights? A bride of 16. Once shy and nervous, Catherine was compelled to reveal the most personal details of her first marriage to her brother-in-law. The true aim was to find a legal pretext if her marriage to Arthur had been consummated. It could be declared incestuous. In validating her union with Henry, the spectacle laid bare Tudor cruelty, forcing a queen to bear her body's history in the name of power. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine's dignified but tremulous answers, her cheeks flushed, eyes weary as she invoked the memory of her long-deceased first husband. Official records note, her replies were brief, her voice quavering, each word a blade cutting her own fate. Catherine had no choice. Refusal meant defying the court and risking further reprisals. Compliance meant the loss of her last shred of privacy. This public dissection destroyed her reputation and stripped her of any remaining authority. Fact 17. Catherine's defiance led to her exile in 1533, when Catherine refused to accept an unjust annulment, insisting one wife only under God's law. Henry responded by banishing her from court. In 1533, She was forcibly removed from Whitehall and sent to Kimbolton Castle in Northamptonshire, a crumbling fortress ill-suited to a queen, allowed only a few belongings. She lost her finest gowns, hair remaining yevils, and her diplomatic papers. At Kimbolton, Catherine was granted a modest stipend, sufficient to support a handful of devoted attendants, but it isolated her entirely from political life. Crucially, she was kept apart from her daughter Mary, now deemed illegitimate and dispatched to live with Anne of Cleves. Catherine's new home was cold and draughty. She spent her days in prayer and written pleas to Henry to allow a final meeting with Mary, petitions that went unanswered. Kimbolton became Catherine's spiritual prison. In her journal she confided, "I grow weaker each day, not only from illness, but from abandonment." Though Henry spared her execution, he sentenced her to die slowly, in obscurity. Her exile was a final act of public shaming, kept alive but hidden away, condemned to fade in solitude. Fact 18. In her final 3 years, Catherine lived in isolation, forbidden to see Mary, from 1533 until her death in January 1536. Catherine remained at Kimbolton, enveloped by a frozen solitude. Although she was the mother of Mary Tudor, the future Bloody Mary, Catherine received no schedule of her daughter's life and saw her only through rare, heavily censored letters. Mary, raised at Castle Farmley, learned of her mother's condition through a trickle of news. Catherine's isolation was compounded by chronic shortages. No skilled physicians visited. Medicine was scarce, and her food was often cold. The harsh winters at Kimbolton, without proper heating, gave rise to respiratory ailments and persistent fever. In weeping appeals, she wrote, "This castle feels like a living tomb, with no corner to rest, my soul." Visiting envoys recorded the pervasive air of mourning that shrouded her rooms. The cruelest deprivation was the denial of contact with Mary. The sacred bond of motherhood, her deepest solace, was severed by Henry's decree. Catherine petitioned the Pope and wrote desperate letters to her husband, but her pleas were ignored. In her final years, she suffered not merely from illness, but from the heartbreak of enforced separation. "Why must my heart remain forever apart from my child?" she lamented. This ultimate act of tyranny, denying a mother her daughter, stands as a stark testament to Henry's ruthless ambition and Catherine's enduring grief. Fact 19. Henry reduced her allowance and condemned Catherine to a crumbling castle. At first, Catherine of Aragon received a generous allowance of £1,000 a year, enough to maintain a modest household. But after her annulment, Henry VIII slashed her stipend to £500 annually, barely sufficient to feed a handful of loyal attendants. Meanwhile, the king lavished funds on sumptuous court entertainments and war campaigns. Catherine was left to eke out an existence on the meagre pittance she was grudgingly granted. By December of 1533, inspectors of Kimbolton Castle, her appointed residents, found broken tiles littering the courtyard, patches of damp mildew on the dining hall walls, and rotting beams in her sleeping chambers. With no seamstress at her disposal, Catherine mended her own gowns by candlelight. When the cold crept in, she burned the few lumps of coal she could afford, huddling beneath a threadbare quilt. Eyewitnesses whispered of the fallen queen, trudging through gloomy corridors, candle in hand, brushing rain from her cloak. Her meals consisted of stale bread and a thin gruel, hardly the fare of a former sovereign. Though Catherine tried to conceal her suffering, her persistent, wheezing cough spoke of pneumonia setting in. Henry knew of her declining health, but refused to restore her allowance or provide medical supplies. In effect, he left Catherine to enjoy the consequences of his choice. This drastic reduction of funds was no mere budget cut. It was a political execution by neglect. Henry had no wish to see Catherine executed outright, for public sympathy might swell against him. Instead, he sentenced her to a slow fade, alive but abandoned, starving but not scandalizing the court. Kimbolton thus became the emblem of Tudor policy toward inconvenient royal women just enough sustenance to keep them breathing, yet not enough to sustain their dignity. Fact 20. Catherine was forbidden to call herself Queen. Reduced to Dowager Princess of Wales, immediately following her annulment, Henry decreed that Catherine must never again style herself as Her Majesty or Queen of England. Instead, all official records, letters, and proclamations were to refer to her only as the Dowager Princess of Wales. This change did more than strip her of a title. It erased the quarter-century of her service, her diplomatic alliances, her cultural patronage, her role in state affairs, rendering her contributions invisible. Every document Catherine signed bore the signature Catherine, Princess of Wales, accompanied by a small, inconspicuous seal in place of the royal device. When she dared to sign a final letter as Catherine the Queen, palace clerks censured her and forced the correction. Yet, in an act of quiet defiance, Catherine slipped her preferred title into a letter addressed to John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, signing herself Catherine the Queen in trembling script. This small rebellion, recorded in surviving palace archives, stands as Catherine's last assertion of identity and honour. By affirming those three words, the Queen, she claimed ownership of her own story, refusing to be written out of history. Henry's ban on the title was meant to obliterate her legacy, to expunge her part in treaties, to deny her regency acts when he was abroad, to erase her name from the annals of English monarchy. Yet Catherine, with pen and parchment, fought back. Her insistence on Queen was more than personal pride. It was a statement on behalf of every woman whose voice the crown chose to silence, even in exile. Her last act was to uphold the truth of her station. By clinging to that title, Catherine of Aragon ensured that history would remember her not merely as a discarded pawn, but as a sovereign who bore the crown in spirit, if not in name. Fact 21. Catherine's final letters, begging to see Mary, went unanswered throughout her 3-year exile at Kimbolton. Catherine of Aragon clung to a single, desperate wish. Once, let me hold my daughter. From 1533 to 1535, she penned a string of heartfelt letters to Henry VIII, each one pleading the same request. An audience with Mary before death claimed her. In trembling script, she wrote, "My Mary is the very blood of my heart. Grant me the honour of seeing her face in my last embrace." Those pages were stained by tears. The ink sometimes blurred as her hand shook with sorrow. Henry received every petition, yet offered no reply. Court records tersely note, "The Princess Dowager's request for audience remains under consideration. His Majesty occupied with matters of state." This polite brush-off only deepened Catherine's despair. She knew Mary had been placed under the guardianship of Anne of Cleves, then Jane Seymour, women without a mother's love. Catherine could not travel alone to Greenwich or London, and each appeal was indefinitely postponed under the pretext of security concerns. By denying Catherine this final wish, Henry not only struck at her maternal bond, but also asserted his absolute power. He could revoke even the most sacred of rights without fear of reproach. Knowing the illness that ravaged her body would soon claim her life, Catherine's last hope was sacrificed. News of Henry's cold indifference spread across Europe, tarnishing his reputation among allies, while Catherine's plight became a poignant emblem of unwavering devotion and the unbreakable spirit of motherhood. Fact 22. Catherine died alone in January 1536, surrounded only by a few faithful attendants. In January of 1536, Catherine's health precipitously declined. Modern scholars suspect cancer or advanced tuberculosis. Lacking proper medicines, she endured relentless fevers and a harsh, rasping cough that sometimes brought blood. Yet even in her final days, she maintained the dignity of royalty. Doctors recorded her greeting visitors with an embroidered veil and formal curtsy. Despite her frailty, on the morning of the 7th of January, Catherine lay dying in her cold chamber at Kimbolton, flanked by only 4 steadfast attendants. Spanish loyalists who had not abandoned her through poverty and exile. As dawn's mist crept across the courtyard, she slipped away, facing westward toward her beloved Aragon homeland. In her last moments, she murmured, "Let me see Mary. If but once." But those words went unheeded. Her body was laid out in the silken white surcoat and simple black coif she had chosen attire, befitting a queen in her own heart. Though Henry had revoked her title, a painting from 1535 captures her wan visage, gaunt features, softened by an unwavering resolute gaze. When word of her passing reached London, Henry ordered only a brief requiem service. No grand procession, nor state funeral. Kimbolton bore silent witness to the end of a woman who had fought tirelessly to preserve her honour. In hushed whispers, local villagers spoke of tears slipping down her tombstone, and many came secretly to lay blossoms upon her grave, honouring in silence the steadfast queen who died alone yet undiminished in spirit. Fact 23. Catherine was buried as Dowager Princess of Wales, not as Queen of England. On the 29th of January 1536, Catherine's remains were transported to Peterborough Abbey for interment. There, she received only the rights of a Dowager Princess of Wales, not the full honours of a queen. Her tomb lies in the abbey's western corner, marked simply Catherine Principis Walli Catherine, Princess of Wales, instead of the expected inscription Regina Anglorum. Henry refused to allocate funds for an elaborate tomb. Instead, a plain stone slab was installed. There was no grand cortege or lamenting choir. Nobles in black cloaks paid their respects in muted ceremony, rather than the regal finery once customary. Privately, common folk brought flowers and lit candles before dawn, mourning their forgotten queen in quiet solidarity. By interring her under a lesser title, Henry sent a clear message. Catherine was no longer the rightful sovereign, her political and cultural legacy consigned to oblivion. Yet in that simplicity, her tomb became more accessible to the public, a humble shrine where subjects could leave tokens of respect. In the years that followed, those whispered tributes reclaimed Catherine's place as queen in the hearts of the people, defying Henry's attempt to erase her memory. Fact 24. Within weeks, Henry hastened to Wednesday, Anne Boleyn, igniting a new tragedy. Barely 6 months after Catherine's passing, Henry VIII turned his attention to Anne Boleyn, the woman he had long pursued. Their secret marriage took place on the 28th of January, 1536. A scant 19 days after Catherine's funeral, Henry left no time for public mourning, for his passions demanded immediate fulfillment. Anne was installed at court without delay, crowned queen in a splendid ceremony, while Mary, Catherine's daughter, was cast aside, barred even from witnessing the coronation. The swift transition appalled. Many whispers spread of Henry's heartlessness, of a king who swept away one wife's memory in the same breath he exalted the next. He lavished Anne with jewels, titles, and power, heedless of the hypocrisy he had accused Catherine of religious and moral failings that he now ignored. The image of Henry celebrating beside Anne, while his daughter Mary wept for her lost mother, or he crystallized the Tudor court's cruelty. No time to mourn, only the relentless pursuit of ambition. Henry's unquenchable thirst for dynastic security and personal desire once again set the stage for another chapter of betrayal and suffering. In the fading candlelight of Catherine's memory, a new tragedy was already unfolding, one that would soon claim Anne Boleyn herself. Fact 25. Anne Boleyn resisted Henry's advances for 7 years before consenting to be his wife. For half a decade, from 1526 until 1533, Anne Boleyn stood firm against King Henry's persistent suit. Far from the caricature of a seductress ensnaring the monarch by guile, she insisted on clarity of status. "I cannot yield my honour without the bond of marriage," she wrote in carefully crafted letters. She reminded him that her family's name and reputation forbade any dalliance before the solemn vow of matrimony. Throughout those years, Henry showered Anne with glittering gifts, jewels, fine cloth, and invitations to royal hunts, accompanied by ardent verses and whispered promises. Yet Anne deftly deflected each overture, neither rebuffing him harshly nor encouraging mere dalliance. She maintained just enough distance to keep him yearning for a future queen rather than a fleeting mistress. By delaying her consent, Anne rewrote the rules of Tudor courtship. She refused to be merely an object of desire. She demanded the dignity of a crowned consort. When Henry finally made her his lawful wife in 1533, it marked a turning point. A royal woman had exercised negotiation, setting a powerful precedent for all who followed. Yet this same insistence on bearing the king's title would draw her into the deadly intrigues that lay ahead. Fact 26. Anne's education in France prepared her for power as queen before her return to England. Anne spent formative years at the court of François I in France, a place where royal women studied statecraft alongside men. There she mastered French and Italian, practiced music and poetry, and absorbed lessons in ancient history and government. Young courtiers watched as Anne observed highborn ladies preside over diplomatic audiences and draft official proclamations. This Gallic schooling shaped Anne's conviction that a queen was not a mere ornament but a political actor. Once in England, she encouraged Henry to recruit Protestant scholars, to translate the scriptures into English, and to consult with her on matters of state. These bold moves shattered the old model of a silent, decorative consort and brought French courtly innovation into Tudor politics. English traditionalists recoiled at her assertiveness, dubbing her a French adventuress who threatened established hierarchies. Yet, in Henry's eyes, Anne embodied the enlightened queen wise, cultured, and influential. Her French-shaped intellect made her indispensable to some, and detested by others, planting the seeds of the fierce opposition that would later seal her fate. Fact 27. Anne actively advised the council and championed religious reform, rejecting the role of merely a beautiful companion. Anne regularly attended sessions of the King's Council, taking notes and offering counsel on taxation, foreign alliances, and most urgently, reforming the English Church. She urged Henry to sever papal authority, to found the Church of England under his leadership, and to permit vernacular translations of the Bible. Cromwell's letters detail her secret correspondence with Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and reformer William Tyndale, pressing for laws to break Rome's hold. On occasion, she even chaired informal gatherings of bishops, explaining the necessity of doctrinal change. Her bold engagement sparked furious backlash among conservative clergy and nobles, who condemned her as overreaching her natural station. For the king, however, Anne's influence signalled a promising era of renewal. He indulged her views, delighting in her counsel, and lauding her as a paragon of progress. Yet this very prominence rendered her a target. The same energy that propelled reform also stirred resentment in men unaccustomed to female authority, setting the stage for the calamitous turn of events to follow. Fact 28. Anne's coronation was staged when she was 6 months pregnant. On the 1st of June 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned in a dazzling ceremony at Westminster Abbey, yet the crowd could plainly see her 6-month engorged silhouette. Henry timed the festivities to demonstrate divine approval. A visibly expectant queen proclaimed the union legitimate and blessed by Providence. Streets thronged with courtiers and commoners alike, watching torchlit processions and festive pageantry that heralded both a new consort and the promise of a royal prince. Proclamations flew across Europe, trumpeting Anne as Henry's perfect match, already fulfilling her paramount role. Still, the spectacle divided the onlookers. Some cheered the vibrant queen. Others whispered, doubts was this grand display mere propaganda, or proof of genuine maternity. Nevertheless, Anne's coronation as the first visibly pregnant English queen shattered tradition and proclaimed that airborne heir as living testimony of the marriage's sanctity. Yet the celebration carried the faint warning of grief to come. Her unborn son would never survive, and the very triumph that crowned her would foreshadow her tragic downfall. Fact 29. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth in 1533. But Henry's joy turned to fury. On the 7th of September, in 1533, the Tudor court welcomed the arrival of Princess Elizabeth, the firstborn daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Instead of the expected jubilation, the celebration quickly soured 5 days later. Henry abruptly cancelled all festivities, withdrew his public congratulations, and even departed early from the birthday banquet held in her honour. He proclaimed in a cold statement, "Elizabeth is cherished. Yet we still require a prince." Royal archives record that Henry's face was flushed with anger as he referred to his newborn daughter as a child most unfortunate. While the populace cheered at the infant's safe delivery, many courtiers whispered that once again, Anne has failed. The hastily withdrawn public ceremonies, no triumphal entries, no poems, no feasting laid bare. The king's ruthless pragmatism. To Henry, Elizabeth was not an innocent joy, but a reminder that the dynastic line remained incomplete. For Anne, the blow was devastating. She had believed her union with Henry would lead to a break with the tragedies of the past. Yet, she found herself reliving Catherine of Aragon's pain, the crushing disappointment of failing to produce a male heir. Elizabeth, growing up under the shadow of her father's dissatisfaction. He would later recall the sharp chill in his gaze whenever her name was spoken. Anne's own devotion was tested, as she channeled all her hopes into the promise of a future pregnancy, unaware that her subsequent losses would plunge her further into despair. This moment marked a turning point. Elizabeth's birth should have secured Anne's position. Yet instead, it illuminated the unforgiving demands of Tudor succession. The little princess bore the weight of her mother's heartbreak, a living symbol of both hope and the harsh reality that, in Henry's eyes, only a son could secure the dynasty. Fact 30. In the 2 years following Elizabeth's birth, Anne suffered 2 miscarriages, deepening Henry's belief in a cursed union. In the span of 2 years after little Elizabeth's arrival, Anne became pregnant at least 2 more times, yet each conception ended in loss. In 1534, she miscarried after 3 months. In 1535, she endured a second miscarriage at around 5 months gestation. With each tragic loss, Henry's faith in their marriage further eroded, as he chalked up these failures to divine disapproval of his union with his brother's widow. Court annals describe Henry pacing the corridors of Hampton Court, his eyes red with tears but edged with blame. "I have done everything in my power, yet God chastises me." Anne was made to endure theological councils of reformers and physicians, who insisted that her reproductive woes were a manifestation of an illegal bond, a stark revelation of impurity that threatens the realm. The narrative painted her as a kind of saboteur of her own fertility. The mounting pressure for a male heir drove Henry to fits of rage. One chronicler recalls him smashing a ceremonial sword on the council table and shouting, "Anne, if you cannot give me a son, I shall seek another solution." Such outbursts reflected his conviction that their marriage was doomed. Haunted by the notion of a cursed union, he began gathering evidence, fabricated or otherwise, to justify Anne's removal. Rumours of witchcraft and infidelity, already whispered in the corridors, found new life as explanations for her recurrent losses. As Anne sank under the weight of suspicion and grief, the court's once fond attitudes turned cold. The very medical shortcomings of Tudor obstetrics, ignorance of infection, crude treatments, and a misunderstanding of miscarriage causes were twisted into evidence of her alleged wrongdoing. The atmosphere of mistrust and despair enveloped Anne, setting the stage for the grave accusations of witchcraft, adultery, and treason that would soon seal her tragic fate. Fact 31. One miscarriage occurred at 15 weeks' gestation, a fully formed boy lost. In the dawn of January 1536, Anne Boleyn hoped that her third child would finally secure the Tudor line. Physicians and midwives alike noted that the fetus, estimated at 15 weeks old, was a robust little prince. Every limb and feature perfectly formed. The court buzzed with hushed excitement. Trumpets readied for a grand announcement. Musicians tuned their lutes for courtly dances. And banners proclaiming royal heir soon to come were draped along London's streets. But mere hours after the medical council pronounced the child healthy, Anne's water broke prematurely, and labour swept her with brutal swiftness. The royal doctors reported, in trembling voices, that the infant perished before drawing breath, body whole but lifeless. Such a crushing loss. At the zenith of hope, plunged Anne into the deepest despair of her queenship. She had spent months under exacting care, special diets, nightly rest, and a suspension of all public duties, only to face heartbreak at the threshold of triumph. King Henry VIII, who had pinned every ounce of faith on this final opportunity, is said to have burst into Anne's chamber in tears, kneeling at her bedside and lamenting, "Without this son, all is lost to me." In the aftermath, a chilling transformation began. Anne, once cherished, became suspect. Whispers circulated that she was a witch hindering the birth. And little Elizabeth, barely 2 years old, was detained at court, forced to witness her mother's agony. In truth, Tudor obstetrics lacked basic understanding of miscarriage causes. Anne's grief and the doctor's ignorance only fueled the narrative that her melancholic disposition had doomed her pregnancy, laying the groundwork for the blasphemy and treason charges to come. Fact: 32 rumours spread that Anne enchanted the king by witchcraft. Her sixth finger became a dark symbol. As Henry's court bristled with factions eager to discredit Anne, a tale took hold that she had woven spells over her husband. The sole evidence was a minute extra nail on her ring finger, a harmless birthmark. Yet, in an age without medical terminology, it was seized upon as the devil's mark. Pamphlets circulated describing how Anne had cast enchantments in the royal bedchamber, binding Henry's passion with sorcery. Ballads and woodcut prints depicted her with a twisted finger, brandishing occult power. Common folk, steeped in superstition, found it easy to believe that a queen could wield magic to enthrall her king. Church sermons hinted that unnatural anatomy was a sign of diabolical favour. Rather than dispel the slander, Henry, a man already disillusioned by repeated losses, allowed the rumours to flourish. He recognised their potency as political weapons. To accuse Anne of witchcraft was to frame her infertility and alleged infidelity as cosmic betrayal. Thus, a simple birth anomaly metamorphosed into proof that Anne had betrayed both crown and creator, giving her detractors the narrative they needed to justify her forthcoming downfall. Fact 33. Even before Anne had healed from her miscarriage, Henry turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Only weeks after Anne's devastating loss in January 1536, Henry VIII's gaze shifted to Jane Seymour, a gentle attendant at court. Jane's sister to the ill-fated Anne of Cleves was known for her quiet grace and steady composure. The king, eager to secure a new alliance and heir, orchestrated meetings under the guise of having Jane revive his garments, providing pretext for private encounters. Remarkably, within 3 days of Anne's tragedy, Henry dispatched a confidential letter summoning Jane to court. French envoys, aghast at the king's haste, remarked that he pursued his newest muse while his queen lay in mourning. According to Cromwell's correspondence, spies within the Privy Chamber reported courtiers whispering that every move was prearranged to facilitate a swift annulment and a fresh marriage. Henry's pursuit of Jane before Anne had even left her sickbed revealed the king's relentless ambition and cold pragmatism. He showed no inclination to nurse his grief or repair his marriage. Instead, he pressed on toward his dynastic goals. By turning to Jane in the weeks of Anne's suffering, Henry displayed a ruthless resolve to replace personal loss with political gain, setting into motion yet another heartbreaking chapter in the Tudor saga. Fact 34. The adultery charges were fabricated to cement a charge of high treason. In April of 1536, Thomas Cromwell and the Conservative faction at court set about constructing a case that would destroy Anne Boleyn forever. They claimed she had carried on illicit affairs with 5 men, among them her own brother, George Boleyn, and a musician named Mark Smeaton. Every testimony was wrung from the accused under duress threats, intimidation, and in Smeaton's case, torture so severe that he confessed simply to end his torment. The spectacle unfolded swiftly and without mercy. At Westminster, a specially convened tribunal branded Anne a wanton adulteress who had betrayed her royal husband and conspired to usurp the crown itself. Under Tudor law, adultery by a queen was no mere moral failing, it was treason, an act of high betrayal against the body politic. The king's lawyers argued that by violating the sanctity of his marriage bed, Anne had assaulted the nation's stability. No genuine defence was permitted. Cromwell's agents supplied every shred of evidence, however flimsy, and presiding nobles nodded in solemn agreement. The accused men were rehearsed in their false testimonies until their words echoed the official script. Anne's very reputation was weaponized. To cast doubt on her virtue was to justify her removal. Within weeks, the court had manufactured a fait accompli, leaving little room for mercy or doubt. This orchestration served a chilling purpose by pinning multiple adulteries on their queen. Cromwell and his allies created a wall of accusations so high that no one could scale it. The screams extracted in secret chambers, the forced confessions, and the rapid-fire hearings combined to suffocate any possibility of a true trial. In the end, the adultery charges were less about infidelity and more about demonstrating that even a queen, no matter how favoured, could be stripped of power and life when the king's will demanded it. Fact: 35 men, executed 2 days before Anne's own beheading. On the 15th of May, 1536, a grim procession formed at the Tower of London. Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn faced a swift and shadowy tribunal, with barely a token hearing. Each was declared guilty of sleeping with the Queen and plotting the King's death. None had the benefit of a proper defence. Only Smeaton had offered any confession, and that only under unbearable torture. By sunset, the 5 men stood at the block. Their executions were carried out in rapid succession. No trumpets, no public spectacle of remorse, just a series of clean strokes of the axe that severed life and testimony at once. The bodies were carted away, and any lingering questions they might have answered were buried with them. 2 days later, on the 17th of May, Anne Boleyn herself was led to the scaffold in the Tower's inner ward. The grim tactic behind executing her alleged lovers first was obvious, with all her supposed conspirators silenced. No living witness could contradict the narrative of her guilt. The King's court had effectively erased every voice that might have spoken in her defence. As Anne ascended the scaffold, she walked past the silent manacles and blood-stained blocks that only days before had claimed the lives of the men accused alongside her. Then, in a final act of calculated cruelty, her executioner, said to be French and hired for his skill, delivered a single, precise stroke, sparing her the indignity of repeated blows. In those 2 days, between the men's deaths and Anne's own, the Tudor regime demonstrated its ruthless efficiency. By eliminating every person who had once been close to Anne, they ensured that no living soul could testify to her character, her faithfulness, or the truth of her final months. The episode remains one of the darkest illustrations of how accusations, once set in motion, can be used to obliterate not only an individual, but any trace of truth she might have carried. Fact 36. Witnesses were silenced, and a swift verdict scripted to convict Anne. By mid-May 1536, Thomas Cromwell's plan to annihilate Anne Boleyn was nearing completion. He and his allies moved with grim efficiency to execute the 5 accused men: Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn on the 17th of May, just 2 days before Anne's own trial. Their summary trial lasted only minutes. No defence counsel. No opportunity to challenge the charges. A committee led by Archbishop Cranmer and Chancellor Audley had pre-written the indictments, and the judges merely nodded them into law. The purpose was chillingly clear: eliminate every potential witness who could contradict Mark Smeaton's coerced confession. By dispatching all 5 before Anne faced the court, the Crown created an airtight case of overwhelming evidence. 5 men condemned for adultery. So the logic went, must mean the Queen's guilt was assured. Rumours quickly spread that this was the most ruthless mass execution of the Tudor era. Ordinary spectators, still drowsy from the early morning hangings. I hardly had chance to sift fact from fiction before the next tragedy overtook the headlines. This orchestrated purge sent a stark warning. No one, not even the Queen's own brother, could defy the King's will. By removing every living voice able to vouch for her innocence, the regime ensured Anne's predicament was inescapable. Stripped of any recourse, she was forced onto the hot seat, facing scripted accusations with no avenue for redress. In the twilight haze of Westminster Hall, justice was not served. It was performed as a political theatre of power. Fact 37. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, presided over Anne's sentence. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk and Anne Boleyn's maternal uncle, found himself thrust into the most harrowing role of his career, presiding judge over his niece's accusations of adultery and treason. Once an ally to Cromwell in strengthening Tudor control, Norfolk chose loyalty to the crown over family ties. Historian G. Richardson notes that, though he received the list of supposed adulterers with gentle courtesy, he unhesitatingly endorsed each baseline charge. Norfolk's courtroom theatrics were ruthless. He denied every motion to postpone, seized defence documents from Anne's advocates, and used his formidable reputation to browbeat any attempt at pardon. His cold impartiality enraged many who expected him to stand up for his own blood. Behind closed doors, surviving correspondence reveals that Norfolk feared losing his standing at court more than witnessing a family tragedy. Thus, he acquiesced to the King's command, ensuring that Anne's trial would proceed without mercy, her dignity trampled beneath official boots. In this cruelty, Norfolk symbolised the moral decay at the heart of the Tudor regime, personal ambition triumphing over familial loyalty, with royalty sacrificing its own kin for the sake of power. Had he dared to intervene, Anne might have secured at least a partial defence. Instead, his silence sealed her fate. His complicity added a bitter layer to her suffering, turning blood ties into instruments of betrayal. Fact 38. Anne's brilliant defence exposed contradictions, but was silenced on that fateful afternoon of the 17th of May. Anne Boleyn was finally granted a brief chance to speak for herself. Drawing on her French-formed legal acumen and her deep understanding of diplomatic nuance, she calmly dismantled the testimonies arrayed against her. She pointed out glaring inconsistencies in the men's statements, mismatched dates, impossible locations, and a total absence of physical proof. She reminded the court that she was visibly pregnant, hardly the profile of a woman engaging in clandestine trysts under the watchful eye of royal guards. With measured grace, Anne asked, "How could I have arranged secret assignations when every step I take is shadowed by royal custodians? How can 2 men claim rendezvous on the same night, when I have preserved records of my presence at council meetings?" As she spoke, one could almost hear the court's collective breath held in suspension. E.W. Ives, in his study The Trial of Anne Boleyn, calls her oration an indictment of the tribunal itself, not of the Queen, but Norfolk would brook no delay. As Anne's voice echoed through the chamber, he rapped his gavel, cutting off her argument mid-sentence, and ordered the final verdict delivered at once. That abrupt silencing, dashing her hopes of reasoned justice, only underscored the gross miscarriage of law. Her eloquent plea, though ignored by her judges, has endured through the centuries as a testament to her courage and the stark betrayal of legal principles. In the dim afterglow of that day, Anne's words remained the last, defiant echo of true justice in a court ruled by fear and decree. Fact 39. Anne's sentence was originally death by burning, then commuted to beheading. In the grim aftermath of her conviction, Anne Boleyn was condemned to the most severe punishment reserved for heresy and high treason execution by fire, under Tuthera Statutis. A queen guilty of adultery was deemed to have defiled not only her husband, but the very fabric of the realm. And the traditional penalty at Tyburn was death by burning. Court officials prepared the cart, the stake, and the pile of wood. The air in London hummed with morbid anticipation. Yet in the small hours before dawn, King Henry VIII, ever mindful of his image at home and abroad, intervened. By royal prerogative alone, he commuted Anne's punishment to beheading, an act publicly heralded as mercy. Yet in truth, motivated by expediency, a single stroke of the sword would spare the gross spectacle of a queen turning to ashes. No parliamentary statute or ecclesiastical council was consulted. The warrant arrived by royal messenger just hours before the appointed hour. Anne herself learned of the reprieve in the hush of her cell, an alteration that granted her no comfort, only a different kind of terror. She was instructed to wear a simple black kerchief, kneel on a scarlet cloth, and brace her neck upon the block. Though described as a humane concession, the change laid bare the king's unbridled authority. He could rewrite the law's most dreadful sentence with a mere stroke of his pen. In the flickering torchlight on the Tower Green, Anne bowed her head to the executioner's blade, transforming what was meant to be the flames of condemnation into a swift, steel-edged finale. Fact 40. During her final weeks in the Tower, Anne clung to royal ritual and prepared for death. From her incarceration on the 2nd of May, 1536, until her last breath, Anne Boleyn remained lodged in the Tower's block tower, the very chamber once reserved for queens awaiting coronation. There, she maintained the strict observances of court life, rising at first, light to don gowns of dove grey and starched white linen, receiving ADCs and gentlemen ushers with graceful curtsies, and dining with her own silverware, each piece a reminder of vanished privilege. Each morning she attended Mass in her private oratory, recited the canonical hours by candlelight, and studied psalms until her voice grew faint. A clerk recorded in wonder that Anne treated the waiting guard with regal courtesy, instructing them in the proper form of address, and ensuring they bowed with the deference due their queen. Her composure in confinement transformed a prison cell into a miniature court, as though to say that even in chains, her dignity could not be stripped away. In quieter moments, Anne drafted tender letters to her 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. With quill in hand and tears staining the parchment, she urged the child to grow in virtue and honour our name. These missives, folded and sealed with her signet, bore witness to a mother's love, enduring beyond the scaffold. She also made arrangements for a loyal chaplain to be at her side until the end, confessing her sins and readying her spirit for what awaited. On the eve of her sentence, Anne practiced positioning her neck for the executioner's sword, determined to grant her daughter a memory of calm resolve. According to fellow inmates, she spent her nights in prayer for Henry and the realm, asking divine forgiveness for all. Even her final days in the ancient tower became a testament to unbroken royal ceremony, a solemn procession of ritual that would echo through history long after the scaffold had been cleared. Fact 41. Anne insisted on a French swordsman to spare herself prolonged suffering, true to her steadfast care for dignity. Anne Boleyn petitioned for a French executioner, skilled with the long sword rather than the traditional English axe. In a letter to Thomas Cromwell she pleaded, "Let my passing be swift and without lingering pain," fearful that an ill-aimed blow of the axe might leave her in agony. Henry VIII, reluctant to appear cruel, granted her request, summoning a renowned French swordsman to London. This choice was extraordinary English, custom-dictated execution by axeman's cleaver, a blow often heavy and imprecise. The imported French executioner, trained to deliver a single, clean cut, represented Anne's final assertion of agency. On the morning of the 17th, at the scaffold's foot, she removed her headdress and, in measured calm, offered her neck to the blade. Witnesses whispered that her final words were a prayer for mercy for all, and that the sword's stroke was so swift and sure that not even a drop of blood spattered the scaffold's boards. Historian Isabel Scoulard later reflected her concern for a merciful death, above all else, speaks to a queen mindful of honour to the last breath. In choosing her executioner and manner of death, Anne reclaimed a final fragment of authority over her fate. Though her life was forfeit, she transformed her end into a deliberate act of defiance, proving that even in the shadow of death, a sovereign could command respect through courage and foresight. Fact 42. On the morning of her execution, Anne appeared in ash grey and pure white veils. In the early dawn of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn mounted the scaffold, dressed in sombre ash-grey silk, her face framed by a fine white veil. The dove-grey hue echoed the mourning of a funeral shroud, while the pristine white linen symbolized her claim to purity, an almost silent rebuke to the charges that had branded her adulteress. In her final letter, Anne had requested 2 outfits, one to wear in the tower's dim chambers, and another for her public farewell. She chose ash grey to mark the day's sorrow, and white to assert, for all to see, her unblemished innocence. Contemporary chronicler Thomas Wriothesley noted the striking tableau. She advanced with solemn grace, as though walking to a rite rather than an execution. Untroubled by fear, Londoners, rubbing their sleep-heavy eyes, fell quiet at the sight. A queen, condemned, yet composed, upholding her dignity, even as the world watched. By selecting her own attire for the scaffold, Anne transformed a moment of enforced humiliation into a final statement of agency. She refused to be draped in ignominy. Instead, her clothing became a canvas upon which she painted her truth, that she would not bow her spirit to the crown's injustice. In choosing these colours, Anne did more than clothe herself. She delivered a wordless testimony. The grey and white, seen by all who gathered, declared that she would not vanish in disgrace, but stand, even in death, as a woman of untainted heart. That deliberate choice would echo down the ages, a visual reminder that in her last hour, she claimed a crown of integrity no earthly verdict could strip away. Fact 43. Her final words were a prayer for the king, and the realm no accusations. Only pardon kneeling at the block. Anne Boleyn spoke only once more to those assembled. Instead of denouncing Henry VIII with recriminations, she offered forgiveness to her enemies and petitions for prayers, both for her soul and for the king's and the kingdom's welfare. She avoided any protestations of innocence or pointed blame, believing that to vilify her sovereign would harm her beloved daughter's future. Eyewitnesses recalled her voice. Soft yet unwavering, I enter this place, trusting in God's mercy. I forgive all who have wronged me, and humbly ask you to pray for the welfare of His Majesty and for the peace of this realm. These words sent a hush through the crowd. A condemned queen imploring blessings on her judge and executioners was an act of astonishing grace. In that brief speech, Anne chose mercy over malice, a final testament that charity, not vengeance, would endure beyond her fall. Her act of forgiveness became the ultimate utterance of her character, by offering up a prayer rather than a tirade. She cast Henry's judges and accusers into moral relief, revealing the kindness she believed should govern even the harshest judgments. Her words, carried home by stunned onlookers, stood as a quiet indictment of the court's cruelty. She forgave those who condemned her, while they offered her no mercy in life. Fact 44. Witnesses claimed Anne's lips moved for seconds after the sword fell. In the moments that followed the executioner's sword, Several bystanders at the Tower of London swore they saw Anne Boleyn's lips continue to quiver, forming silent words for a heartbeat or two. A guard noted in his diary, though her head lay severed, her mouth seemed drawn in prayer, as though she sought one final appeal. At the time, clerics and commoners alike interpreted this eerie flicker as proof that Anne's spirit lingered, perhaps striving to speak her last prayer, or call out for that one embrace of motherhood she had longed for. Modern physiology might explain the phenomenon as post-mortem muscle reflex, but in 1536, it felt little short of miraculous. To those who witnessed it, the trembling lips were the whisper of a queen who would not be silenced. Even in death, this haunting image spread through England like a half-remembered dream, a headless sovereign whose final motion was the movement of living flesh. It became emblematic of the injustice she endured, her story imprinted on the collective memory as the queen who, though beheaded, still strove to speak truth, faith, and love. For centuries, the trembling lips at the scaffold's edge would linger in Tudor lore, a spectral echo of Anne's resolve and the cruel paradox of her fate. Fact 45. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, Henry was already betrothed to Jane Seymour. On the 20th of May, 1536, merely one day after Anne Boleyn fell beneath the executioner's sword, Henry VIII publicly proclaimed his engagement to Jane Seymour. Witnesses later recalled the startling swiftness of this transition in the eyes of the court and capital. The king appeared untouched by grief, as if his personal tragedy had been no more than an inconvenient pause. Early that morning, royal messengers circulated Henry's terse directive: "Our state's duties must not falter." Jane, already sheltered within the palace walls, received word that she was to be recognized as the king's intended. She was swiftly accorded the status of lady in waiting to the sovereign. An official precursor to marriage and preparations for their nuptials were set in motion within a matter of weeks. London's courtiers and commoners alike watched in stunned silence. The monarch who had just presided over his wife's downfall now moved at lightning speed to secure another. This lightning-fast betrothal laid bare the absolute nature of Henry's will. His capacity to order a queen's death on one day and pledge himself to another the next erased any illusion that the sovereign might feel constraint by mourning or moral hesitation. It was a stark reminder that, in Henry's realm, the lives and deaths of royal women existed merely to serve his dynastic aims. In less than 24 hours, courtly faces reset to welcome a new queen, demonstrating that the only constant under Henry's reign was his own inexorable drive for heirs and authority. Fact 46. Jane Seymour was chosen for her quiet deference, a complete contrast to Anne. In the wake of Anne's dramatic fall, Henry and his advisers sought a new consort who would embody perfect compliance: Jane Seymour. Younger sister of Anne of Cleves Lady-in-Waiting, matched every criterion. The king now prized, she possessed a gentle meekness, lacked any pretensions to political counsel, and had never ceded controversy within court circles. On the 20th of May, she was summoned to Westminster, and Henry formally announced his intention to wed her just one day after Anne's execution. Jane's years serving first Anne of Cleves and then Anne Boleyn had inculcated in her a rigid understanding of courtly obedience, but without the assertiveness that had marked her predecessor. She spoke little of religion or state affairs, addressing Henry only as "Your Majesty," and lowering her eyes whenever he entered a room. To Henry's advisers, she was the living antithesis of the politically savvy Anne Boleyn. No theological debates, no demands for influence, just constant, uncomplaining submission. Meanwhile, Jane's family sprang into action to smooth her path to queenship. Her elder brother Edward and their kin drafted instructions on how she should comport herself before the king practice. The slightest nod instead of argument, refrain from any display of opinion, and cultivate a grateful humility whenever Henry bestowed a gift. Jane attended day-long rehearsals in the privy chambers, perfecting the angle of a curtsy, the tone of a single "Yes, sire," and the disciplined stillness expected of the ideal consort. By the time of their wedding on the 30th of May, Jane presented as the very model of the complete woman of court, devoid of any trace of the robust intellect or spirited counsel that had characterized Anne. In sparing Jane from political engagement, Henry believed he had found his safe harbour, a queen who would yield every aspect of her life to his sovereign prerogative, ensuring that no royal wife could ever again challenge his authority or stir controversy in God's Church of England. Fact 47. The Seymour family groomed Jane in the art of absolute obedience. Almost immediately after the engagement announcement, Edward Seymour summoned his sister for a rigorous regimen of courtly training. He and their relatives compiled a guide to royal conduct for Jane, an exhaustive list of do's and don'ts, meticulously designed to eliminate any risk of misstep. Rule number 1. Never contradict the king or raise your voice in his presence. Rule number 2. If Henry speaks on matters of state, respond only with a head bowed. Rule number 3. On receiving royal gifts, express gratitude with simple, repeated phrases like, "My deepest thanks," "Your Majesty." In the days leading up to the wedding, Jane would sit motionless in the royal antechamber, awaiting her cue to greet the sovereign, practicing a sequence of curtsies timed to the minute by her family's watch. She drilled the words "yes," "sire," until they formed a reflex instead of thought, and learned to maintain polite silence, even when her heart might have rebelled. Jane's diet was restricted to simple fare, on the premise that physical ease would help her preserve a serene countenance. The Seymour household limited her reading to an approved abridgment of scripture, believing that broader texts would only introduce unwelcome ideas. This transformation was thorough and chillingly successful. At court, Jane moved with an almost puppet-like precision, never a question, never a hint of personal conviction, only the performance of dutiful subservience. Henry, weary of wives, who had once tested his patience with theology or statecraft, found solace in Jane's simplicity. After the nuptials, he praised her as a beam of peace amidst the storms of politics, casting her in contrast to his former queens as the embodiment of a dutiful wife who bent every will to his. By the end of her first year as queen, Jane's perfect compliance had endeared her to the king and, tragically, cemented her role as yet another device in Tudor power games, rather than as an independent partner. Through her training, the Seymour family ensured that Jane would serve as the ideal royal consort, never seen arguing a point, never heard expressing an opinion, and always ready to subsume her own identity beneath the crown's unyielding weight. Fact 48. Jane was still serving as a lady-in-waiting to Anne, when Henry first sought their eyes long before Jane Seymour stepped into the role of queen. She quietly attended to Anne Boleyn's needs. Between 1526 and 1533, while Henry VIII was wooing Anne, Jane stood a rank below her future rival, brushing Anne's hair, tailoring her headpieces, and ensuring every banquet tray was flawless. Each day, Jane flitted through Anne's chambers, sweeping floors, laying out pastries, and curtsying deeply whenever the king or a courtier entered. It was precisely this unassuming presence that made Jane the ideal foil to Anne's bold ambition once Anne fell from favour. Henry had observed Jane's humble dignity, how she lowered her gaze, and spoke only when spoken to, in sharp contrast to Anne's commanding intellect and outspoken counsel. Even as Anne prepared for motherhood, Jane was at her side, performing the most menial tasks without complaint. Court whispers recalled Henry slipping into Jane's quarters through half-closed doors to converse in lowered tones. Jane's bashful responses convinced him she deemed him worthy of respect. Noble murmured, "She dares not look him in the eye." But to Henry, that was a testament to her unwavering loyalty. With no aspiration for political influence, Jane sought only quiet devotion. This very quality, utter safety within Tudor intrigue, propelled her from humble attendant to crowned consort in mere days. Fact 49. Henry married Jane, just 11 days after Anne's execution. On the 30th of May, in 1536, barely 11 days after Anne Boleyn's downfall, Henry VIII quietly wed Jane Seymour at Greenwich Palace. The ceremony was intimate and unannounced. No foreign ambassadors. No. Glittering procession. Only the king's closest friends and privy councillors in attendance. This hush-hush nuptial spoke volumes. Henry wished to minimise scandal and to allay any doubts about his pressing need for a male heir. Jane donned a simple white gown and a slender circlet. She knelt before the throne to speak brief vows, exchanged rings without fanfare, and was hailed queen for a second time within 2 weeks of Anne's death. Foreign envoys noted the expedients. The king treats marriage as a duty, accomplish it swiftly, then proceed to more pressing affairs. For Jane, the honour of queenship arrived hand in hand. With anxiety she inherited not only the privileges, but also the peril of bearing Tudor offspring. Her future would be measured solely by her ability to produce a son, rather than any personal merit or political acumen. Fact 50 Jane's motto was obéir, et servir, to obey and serve, a declaration of total submission. When Jane Seymour became queen, she selected her personal motto in Latin, obeidire et servire, to obey and serve. Where Anne Boleyn had chosen the most happy, Jane embraced verbs that encapsulated her entire purpose, submission and service. That phrase was emblazoned on her ceremonial mantle, carved above her private chambers at Hampton Court, and woven into tapestries in the royal apartments. It broadcast one clear message. Jane claimed no political power, sought no independent voice, and existed solely to uphold the king's will. Contemporary scholars argue that this unassuming motto was Jane's most potent political instrument. It reassured wary courtiers and conservative clergy that she would never challenge their privileges or stir religious controversy. It signalled to Henry that his new consort would never vex him with demands or dissent. In an era when queens could be catalysts for upheaval or reform, Jane's simple creed obeidire et servir ensured her survival in one of Europe's most mercurial and ruthless courts. By pledging herself to absolute deference, she carved out a space of relative security, even as the Tudor throne roiled with ambition and peril. And there we have it, our first 50 fascinating facts laid bare. A journey full of surprises and shocks. But don't go anywhere yet, because in part 2 we'll unveil another 50 truths that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about this tumultuous era. Now it's your turn. Which of these facts had you nodding in agreement? And which ones made you raise an eyebrow in doubt? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and can't wait to discuss. Until we meet again in part 2. May your evening be peaceful, your dreams sweet, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss a single revelation. Sleep well, everyone.